You remember the moment, not the date, not the exact words, just the feeling. You are standing somewhere you haven't seen in years, maybe a childhood bedroom, a school hallway, the kitchen of a house your family no longer lives in. The light was coming through the window in a certain way. You could almost hear someone's voice. You could almost smell the air. And for a few seconds, it felt like you'd gone back, not remembered, returned. You trusted that memory because it felt so intimate, so private, almost sacred. But then something strange happened. Someone else who was there told the story differently. They remembered the room being on the other side of the house. They remembered your mother saying something you don't remember at all. They insisted you were wearing a blue shirt when you can see, with absolute certainty, a red one. And suddenly, something you thought belonged entirely to you became uncertain. What if the memory you have been carrying for 20 years isn't a recording of what happened? What if it's a reconstruction? And if your memories can change without you noticing, what happens to the person you believe you are? Because there is a much deeper question hiding underneath all of this. If your memories are constantly being rewritten, then who exactly is from your life? You probably don't think about memory very often. You simply use it. You wake up and remember your name. You remember where you live. You remember the people you love. You remember what you do for a living, what you believe, what you've been through, what you're afraid of. You remember the mistakes you made. You remember the moments you're proud of. You remember the person you used to be. And all of those memories seem to form one continuous thread. Yesterday became today. Childhood became adulthood. The person who stood in front of the mirror 10 years ago somehow became the person looking back at you now. We rarely question that continuity. But perhaps we should. Because your brain does not contain a tiny movie theater where perfect recordings of your life are stored, waiting to be played whenever you press the right mental button. Memory is stranger than that. Every time you remember something, your brain is doing something closer to reconstruction. And that means the past you carry around inside your mind may not be the past that actually happened. This sounds frightening at first, but it gets even stranger. You can remember something that never happened. You can forget something that shaped you. You can become emotionally attached to an interpretation of an event rather than the event itself. And over time, the interpretation can become more real than the original experience. That may explain something you've experienced without knowing how to describe it. Have you ever remembered being a certain kind of person as a child? Maybe shy, maybe rebellious, maybe sensitive, maybe the responsible one, maybe the difficult one, maybe the kid who never fit in. And then, years later, you begin telling stories about yourself that seem to prove it. I've always been like this. I've never been good at relationships. I've always been anxious. I've never been confident. I'm just not that kind of person. Those sentences sound like observations, but sometimes there's something else. Their memories turned into identity. And once a memory becomes part of your identity, you don't just remember it, you defend it. You organize your life around it. You search for evidence that confirms it. And you may not even realize you're doing it. This is one reason human beings are so fascinating. We don't simply experience reality. We construct a version of reality that allows us to make sense of ourselves. For thousands of years, humans have been doing this. Long before MRI machines, cognitive laboratories, or neuroscience textbooks, people were already asking the same unsettling question. What makes you the same person across time? The ancient Greeks wrestled with it. The Stoics understood that our relationship with events could become more important than the events themselves. Buddhist thinkers went even further, questioning the assumption that there is some permanent, unchanging self underneath experience. And centuries later, philosophers continued pulling at the same thread. If everything about you changes, your body, your beliefs, your relationships, your environment, your desires, what exactly remains? There is an old philosophical puzzle about a ship that gradually has every one of its parts replaced. The wood changes, the sails change, the ropes change. Eventually, none of the original material remains. Is it still the same ship? Now take the puzzle and place it inside your own head. Your body changes, your cells change, your opinions change, your relationships change, your personality changes. And your memories change too. Yet somewhere inside you is an incredibly powerful feeling that says, I am still me. Maybe memory is one of the things that creates that feeling, not because it gives you a perfect record of your life, but because it gives you a story. And stories are extraordinarily powerful. Yuval Noah Harari has spent much of his work examining the strange ability humans have to cooperate around shared stories. Stories about nations, money, religion, corporations, laws, identities, and imagined futures. But there is another story that may be even more intimate. The story you tell yourself about yourself. You don't need millions of people to believe it. You only need your own brain to believe it. And once it does, the story can become the invisible architecture of your life. Think about the last time you told someone a story from your childhood. You probably didn't retrieve every detail. You selected certain moments. You connected them. You gave them meaning. Maybe you said, "That was when I realized I couldn't trust people." But did you really realize that in that moment? Or did the meaning come later? This distinction matters, because the adult you is not simply looking backward. The adult you is looking backward from the position of everything that happened afterward. You know how the relationship ended. You know what happened to your family. You know whether the career worked out. You know which friendship survived. You know which decision you regret. And that knowledge can quietly reshape the way you remember the beginning. The past does not remain untouched just because it already happened. Your brain keeps revisiting it, and every visit can alter the story. This is where neuroscience becomes almost poetic. Memory isn't like opening a file on a computer. It is more like rebuilding a house from blueprints that have been edited every time you've used them. When you remember something, different networks in the brain work together to reconstruct aspects of the experience. Emotion matters. Contextual matters. Your current beliefs matter. What you expect to find matters. Even the question someone asks you can influence what you later remember. That's why memory researchers have demonstrated something deeply uncomfortable. Human beings can develop vivid memories for events that did not happen exactly as remembered. And in some circumstances, can develop memories for events that never happened at all. That doesn't mean every memory is false. It doesn't mean you should distrust everything you've ever experienced. It means something subtler. Memory can be sincere and inaccurate at the same time. You can be completely honest about something you remember incorrectly. And perhaps that is one of the hardest truths about the mind. We tend to assume that confidence equals accuracy. If you remember something clearly, you assume it must be true. But clarity is not proof. Emotional intensity is not proof. Certainty is not proof. A memory can feel photographic without actually being photographic. Think about eyewitness testimony. A person sees something terrifying happen. The event lasts seconds. Years later, they may still remember the face, the movement, the sound. And yet the human brain is vulnerable to suggestion, stress, expectations, and the passage of time. Two people can witness the same event and walk away with different memories. Neither person has to be lying. Their brains simply constructed different versions. Now bring that idea closer to home. Think about an argument you've had with someone you love. You remember what they said. They remember what you said. You remember the look on their face. They remember the look on yours. And both of you may genuinely believe you're describing the same conversation. But you're not. You're describing two reconstructions. And sometimes a relationship can slowly become a courtroom, where two people keep presenting evidence from memories neither one can fully verify. This is where memory becomes more than a neuroscience problem. It becomes a human problem. Because we don't merely use memories to understand the past. We use them to decide what the past means. And that meaning influences what we do next. A person who remembers rejection everywhere may become hyper-alert to rejection. A person who remembers being abandoned may become terrified of closeness. A person who remembers failure as proof of inadequacy may avoid opportunities that could have changed their life. A person who remembers themselves as weak may interpret every difficult moment as evidence that they are still weak. The memory becomes a prediction. The prediction changes the behavior. The behavior creates new experiences. And those experiences become new memories. Suddenly you have a loop. You remember who you were. That memory influences how you behave now. Your behavior shapes what happens next. And what happens next becomes evidence for the original story. You might think you're remembering your identity, but in some ways, you're continuously manufacturing it. This is one reason Nietzsche's ideas about self-creation remain so psychologically interesting. He understood that human beings are not simply passive containers of facts. We interpret, we assign meaning, we turn suffering into narratives. We decide which experiences will become wounds, which will become lessons, and which will become excuses. And yet there is danger here, because if you can reinterpret the past, you can also distort it. You can romanticize what hurt you. You can demonize people who were more complicated than the role you've assigned them. You can turn yourself into either the hero or the victim of every story. Sometimes we do this because the truth is harder to live with. The truth might be that nobody was entirely right. Nobody was entirely wrong. You were young. They were young. Everyone was operating with incomplete information. Some people hurt you without understanding the damage they were causing. And sometimes you hurt people without understanding it either. Real life is messy. Memory prefers stories. Stories have villains, stories have heroes, stories have beginnings and endings. Life often has none of those things. This may be why ancient philosophy placed such importance on observing the mind. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to the idea that we suffer not only from what happens, but from the judgments we attach to what happens. The Stoic insight wasn't that pain isn't real. It was that our interpretation of pain can become another source of pain. And neuroscience gives that ancient intuition a modern dimension. Your brain is constantly predicting. It doesn't wait passively for the world to arrive. It anticipates, it compares, it updates, it searches for patterns. And memory is part of that predictive machinery. The brain uses the past to anticipate the future, which means your memories are not merely behind you. They're participating in what you expect to happen next. If your past taught you that people leave, you may enter relationships looking for signs of departure. If your past taught you that failure is humiliating, you may avoid situations where you could fail. If your past taught you that nobody notices you, you may stop speaking before anyone has the opportunity to listen. The past can become a lens. And eventually, you forget you're wearing it. This is where the question becomes almost existential. What if the memories you trust most are not neutral descriptions of who you were? What if they're instructions for who you are allowed to become? Because identity has a strange gravitational force. Once you've told yourself, this is who I am, the mind starts protecting the statement. Psychologists sometimes describe this through concepts like confirmation bias and self-consistency. We tend to notice information that fits our existing beliefs and overlook information that challenges them. So if you've built your identity around being unlucky, you'll remember the bad breaks. If you've built it around being successful, you'll remember the moments you overcame obstacles. If you've built it around being unlovable, you'll remember every rejection. But what happens to the moments that don't fit? The person who stayed, the opportunity you earned, the time you were brave, the apology you received, the kindness you gave, the version of yourself that existed outside the story? Sometimes those memories become quieter simply because they don't fit the character you've decided to play. And modern technology has made this even more complicated. Your phone remembers for you. Photos appear from years ago. Social media reminds you what you were doing on a particular date. Cloud storage preserves thousands of moments your biological memory would have lost. At first, this seems wonderful. We can keep our lives. But there's an irony. The more technology remembers for us, the more selective our own memory may become. Because now the past comes back to us through algorithms. You don't necessarily remember what happened. You remember the version of what happened that your device showed you. A photo from a vacation becomes the vacation. A handful of pictures from a relationship become the relationship. A post from 10 years ago becomes evidence of who you used to be. And suddenly your past isn't just stored in your brain. It's being curated outside your brain. Social media adds another layer. You don't only remember yourself. You remember yourself through images you once chose to show other people. Think about that. There may be moments from your life that you remember primarily because you photographed them. And there may be moments you barely remember because nobody did. The technology designed to preserve your memories may also influence which memories feel important. Then comes artificial intelligence. I can summarize your conversations, organize your photos, generate images of your past, reconstruct voices, docrecate faces, produce convincing scenes that never happened. The boundary between remembering, recording, reconstructing, and generating is becoming thinner. And that raises a question our ancestors could never have imagined. What happens when machines become better at preserving the appearance of your past than your own mind? Would you trust the archive? Or would you trust the person you became afterward? There is something deeply human about wanting an accurate past. We want to know what really happened. We want to know whether we were loved, whether we were betrayed, whether we were good enough, whether we made the right decision, whether our parents understood us, whether we wasted our 20s, whether we chose the wrong person, whether another version of our life was waiting somewhere behind one different decision. But memory cannot give us perfect access to those answers. And perhaps that limitation is not merely a flaw. Perhaps it's part of what makes consciousness possible. Because if you remembered everything with perfect accuracy, you might not experience your life as a coherent story. You would experience an avalanche, every sound, every face, every smell, every embarrassment, every ordinary Tuesday, every passing thought, every conversation you forgot 5 minutes after having it. Forgetting is not simply failure, it is also filtering. The mind has to decide what deserves to remain. And sometimes what remains isn't what was objectively most important, it's what was emotionally significant. That's why a smell can suddenly bring back a childhood kitchen. A song can reopen a relationship you haven't thought about in years. The sound of a particular car can make you feel 8 years old again. The body remembers associations that the conscious mind may have forgotten. And this is where memory becomes almost mysterious. You can forget the story and keep the feeling. You can forget the face and keep the fear. You can forget the words and keep the longing. Somewhere inside the nervous system, the past can continue speaking even after the conscious mind has stopped listening. Buddhist philosophy offers a particularly radical perspective here. The self may not be a permanent object. It may be a process. Thoughts arise. Sensations arise. Memories arise. Desires arise. They change, they disappear. New ones replace them. And yet the mind weaves them into the impression of a continuous me. Modern psychology doesn't require us to accept every Buddhist claim, but the parallel is fascinating. The person you call yourself may be less like a solid object, and more like an ongoing process of reconstruction. Wake up every morning and, in a sense, your brain reconnects the pieces. Here is my body, here is my name. Here is where I live, here's what happened yesterday, here's what I'm worried about, here's what I'm supposed to do today. Here are the people who matter to me. And from all of this, the feeling of I emerges not necessarily as a fixed thing, but as continuity. As a story that keeps updating itself. Maybe that's why losing your memory feels so terrifying. We often imagine memory loss as losing information, but at a deeper level, it can feel like losing the thread connecting one moment of existence to another. Without memory, who are you? And here's the uncomfortable reversal. If memory helps construct the self, then perhaps you don't need to recover some perfectly authentic version of yourself. Perhaps there never was one. Perhaps there has only ever been a changing human being, interpreting a changing life. That doesn't mean nothing is real. It means reality is more complicated than the story you tell about it. Your pain is real. Your childhood happened. The people you loved existed. The decisions you made had consequences. But the meaning you assign to those things can evolve. And that is where something quietly hopeful appears. If memory is reconstructive, then the past does not have to remain psychologically frozen. You cannot change what happened. But you can sometimes change what it means. That is not pretending. It's not erasing. It's not forcing yourself to be positive. It's recognizing that an event and the story you build around the event are not always the same thing. Maybe you were rejected. That happened. But therefore I am unworthy is an interpretation. Maybe you failed. That happened. But therefore I am a failure is an identity claim. Maybe someone left. That happened. But everyone eventually leaves is a prediction. And predictions can be questioned. This is where self-observation becomes more powerful than self-improvement. You don't always need to fix yourself. Sometimes you need to watch yourself. Watch the story appear. Notice the sentence your mind automatically produces. I always do this. They never understand me. People like that can't be trusted. I'm just not confident. I've been this way my whole life. Then ask something deceptively simple. Is that actually true? Not can I find evidence that proves it? Ask whether the story is complete. Because the mind loves evidence. But wisdom often begins with noticing what the evidence leaves out. When was the last time you remembered something differently after hearing someone else's version? When was the last time you discovered that a memory you'd carried for years wasn't quite as accurate as you thought? And more importantly, what story about yourself are you still carrying simply because you've repeated it for so long? Maybe you were told you were difficult. Maybe you were told you weren't smart. Maybe you were compared to someone else. Maybe one rejection became the moment you decided you weren't desirable. Maybe one failure became the day you stopped taking risks. Maybe something happened when you were young, and you built an entire philosophy of life around it. You may not remember making that decision, but you may still be living inside it. This is why becoming aware of your memories isn't about distrusting yourself. It's about becoming less controlled by the unconscious conclusions you've attached to them. There is a difference between saying, "This happened to me," and saying, "This is who I am." That difference may be one of the most important psychological distinctions you can make. Because the first statement describes an event, the second creates a prison. And perhaps this is where Harari's broader question about human stories becomes personal. Civilizations are built from shared stories. But individual lives are built from private ones. The nation says, "This is who we are." The company says, "This is what we value." The culture says, "This is what success looks like." And somewhere underneath all of that, the individual says, "This is me." But how much of that story did you actually choose? How much came from your parents, your school, your friends, your culture, your first relationship, your worst relationship, your social media feed, your successes? your failures, your memories, and how much of it is simply a narrative that became familiar enough to feel like truth. You don't have to destroy the story. You don't have to become someone completely different. You simply have to realize that a story is a story. That small distance can change everything. The Stoics practiced something close to this when they tried to separate events from judgments. Existentialist thinkers confronted the burden of creating meaning in a world that doesn't hand us a finished identity. Jung explored the hidden parts of the psyche we don't like to acknowledge. Buddhist traditions questioned attachment to a permanent self. Modern neuroscience shows us a brain constantly predicting, reconstructing, filtering, and updating. Different traditions, different languages. But they keep circling the same mystery. The human being is not merely living. The human being is interpreting the experience of living. And memory is one of the main tools through which that interpretation survives. So perhaps your memories aren't really yours in the way you imagined. They are not possessions, they are processes. They are shaped by other people, by emotions, by language, by culture, by time. Your mother is inside some of your memories. Your childhood friends are inside others. The books you've read, the movies you've watched, the stories you've been told about your family, the stories you've told yourself. Even the person you are today reaches backward and changes what the person you were seems to mean. Your memories may belong to you, but they were never created by you alone. And perhaps that's not something to fear. Perhaps it's something to understand. Because if the self is partly a story, then becoming conscious of the story gives you a little more freedom. Not unlimited freedom, not magical freedom, just enough freedom to pause, to notice, to ask.